I would like to make a suggestion to go down the idea if we did stay separate from the EU, where does that path kind of lead? Um, Also, is there a possibility that we could reduce the friction if eventually it would completely go away, being a separate part of the EU, for trades, obviously? And is there also a possibility that we could rejoin, um, or um, pioneer a new kind of some sort of other alternative to the EU, like a new, maybe something in the contract, or like, because just to get people behind something new, something a new idea. I think what was really interesting, what you said about communication, how people have been swayed, and I find it ridiculous that a whole country has been manipulated, or from what you're saying, has been tricked into voting for this, or voting for Farage to get into, to basically, he's used this as like an arrowhead to get him in power, basically. Um, but yeah, I find I don't understand generally how there can be no benefits to leaving the EU besides, besides reducing migration, and yeah, I don't understand. I literally don't know what the benefits of leaving was, besides like independence, I guess.
So you mentioned, for example, what was the end goal here? I think some of the people, it's difficult because it's difficult to articulate what the end goal was because there were different groups working together, and all of them had the one goal of we need to get out. Now, some of them were about we just need to reduce immigration, Farage in particular, and then Boris Johnson gove, which probably didn't actually think that it was actually going to happen because Boris Johnson had written two letters, one saying, we won, and the other was like, sorry, we lost, basically. But it was Michael Gove and Boris Johnson's idea was about taking back control. So if we take back control, we'll be able to turn the country into something prosperous. Now, the problem, I think, and you also asked the question about, well, would if the UK just remained outside, would the trade restriction, the friction just disappear over time? Well, not really, because the point of the single market is to protect the members within the single market. So it's possible that the UK and the EU can work together to reduce some of the friction, but there will always have to be friction because the UK is not. So I say the UK, I should say GB because Northern Ireland is separate, but GB is outside the single market. In the same way as other countries who are outside the single market, the European Union, and this was actually driven by the British when they were in the European Union. They were the ones who were writing the law saying, look, we need to have a strong single market to keep the other countries out, not to keep them out, but to stop them from flooding our market. We need to protect our market. It needs to be strong. So it was the Brexiteers were the ones who discovered in a sense, the hard way politically, that once you're outside the single market, it's very difficult to trade back into it. For the reasons that they agreed with some years before. So will the trade improve? Yeah, it can improve. The UK can sign deals. They're trying to sign ones on veterinary agreements at the moment. They're trying to sign deals with the European Union on a number of areas. They're trying to reduce the friction between GB and Northern Ireland, and that will. There are ways that it can be improved. The UK signs up to agreements where they recognise each other's certifications. So there are ways the friction can be reduced, but it will never be eliminated as long as GB is outside the single market, because the single market exists to protect the members within it. So I don't know if that's answered your question there. And then the idea of why would people vote on this if because people didn't, as I said, it's like people back in 2016 were tired of austerity. So the Tories had imposed austerity for a number of years. Public services were on their knees. People looked around and saw that the situation is not improving, and it's not as bad as it was now, as it is now. It was much better back in 2016, but people just felt worse off. And you had people like David Cameron coming along and saying, "Hey, you should vote to remain in the European Union." Why? Well, because it'd be worse outside. And this was not and for many people looking around who said, and this is not, I'm not defending the vote because I think it was a disaster, but many people looked around and said, hey, it can't get any worse than this. And then Nigel Farage and others come along and say, hey, if you vote to leave, we're going to prioritize you. You're going to have a GP because look at all these foreigners coming in. These foreigners are sucking up all the resources. If we leave the EU, they'll all go home and then we'll have all these resources available for British people. And then, of course, the media, I'm extremely critical about the media on my channel. It's how Farage was allowed on. He was never really challenged. He had his own show on LBC. He was able to use that as a platform. Whatever the discussion, he was able to say, see, if we leave the European Union, and the arguments he made sounded reasonable. Because if you think, well, we have a shortage, like people can't access a GP. So they think it's a supply and demand issue. So if we reduce the supply, if we reduce the demand, then the supply will be able to fit it. But that works if you think that the GP is British or the GP is only in Britain. Well, if the GP is coming from abroad or the GP relies on workers in their surgery or whatever, if they're relying on workers in their surgery, whatever, or the hospital, the NHS would be better off if there are fewer foreigners. Well, yeah, but a lot of the foreigners are working in the NHS. So if they go, then the NHS is worse off. So you even if you have fewer people coming into the NHS to use the services, you have fewer doctors and nurses. So the NHS is worse off. So the workers who remain have to work more hours and they end up being burnt out and then they leave because the conditions are bad. So on the surface, Farage was saying, oh, well, so if we leave the European Union, there'll be less requests for housing because all these foreigners are taking up the housing. But he forgets to realize that a lot of the foreigners were in the industry to build the houses. So if you kick them out, there's actually a 50,000 labourer shortage in the construction sector at the moment. And the Labour government are saying that they want to build 1.5 million homes. There are a lot of issues, but that has to be one that has to be taken into account. I don't know if they can achieve this. I think it's too ambitious, not just because of the shortage of workers post-Brexit, but also because of a lot of land banking and developers not wanting to develop buildings because it's more profitable just to sit on it. So there are a lot of issues.
One question I do have, and you kind of touched on it, is we've got to get the politicians to start thinking about, going back to the EU. Not a rejoin, but I guess as a completely new process of looking to join the EU. How would we start that process? Now, I know it goes through ratification and there's a lot of arguing and there's a lot of backwards and forwards and negotiations, but there must be something that could be done right now to say, okay, UK or GB or whichever bit of it you want, we're putting the request in. It might take 5 years, 8 years, 10 years, but it's in and it's going to be an ongoing process. And as they did with Brexit, where they started to employ millions of civil servants to start all these changes to the regulations and removal of the EU and that sort of stuff, we then start that process again. But do you think there's something that could be done that's not as drastic as a referendum, by the way, which should have been monitored by the EU or some independent observers back in 2016 to ensure it was being held properly? But just want to know what you know from other countries that have applied to join or that have joined the European Union since. What can we do? What examples can we take from there to help us push ourselves back into that arena again?
It's an interesting question, and I think it's interesting as you raise the point there that it's not about rejoining on the same conditions; it's rejoining under new conditions, and that's really important for people to understand that the UK jumping back in things would not be like reset. It would not be a reset and everything going back to the way it was before. So it is interesting to look at the countries who are joining and to look at the process. So they begin by reaching out to the European Union and saying, look, this is what we want to be part, and we have met the criteria, the Copenhagen criteria. So we've promoted the European Union, or we have met at certain thresholds or whatever requirements when it comes to the economy or dealing with corruption. For example, this is an issue that Ukraine has a long history of corruption within the country, and I think if they want to join the European Union, they need to deal with that, and they are dealing with it. And while you hear stories about how there's a lot of corruption in Ukraine, and there is, of course, it's a country that has long had to deal with it. it's important that they're dealing with it, and they should be commended for dealing with it. So the UK would have to go through the same criteria. Now, what we can do on the outside, I think, is constant. We have to constantly pressure politicians. The politicians are the ones who are in the driving seat. So, while the public may be on board with rejoining, the politicians are still holding back. And I think as I said with the previous question, we need to sit down with the politician. We need to convince them that, look, it's in their interest. If the UK joins, it will be good for the economy. It will improve people's lives. People will be better off. And we have to have these arguments. We have to have these conversations with the politicians and convince them that it's in their interest. Now, they may be saying, well, it's not in our interest at the moment because we have to focus on cost of living. But I think there's something we can take from Farage. When Farage was in UKIP, he linked everything to leaving the European Union. So he was able to get on TV and he was able to talk about how if we leave the European Union, it'll fix the economy. If we leave the European Union, it'll bring down immigration. If we leave the EU, people will be able to access their GP or access the NHS. And we have to be using the same arguments in reverse. It's difficult. Like I'm on YouTube. I use the YouTube platform as much as I can. But if you know somebody who is good at, who can go on TV, ask them to, speak with them, try and get them to get on and, in a sense, smuggle in, like what Farage was doing when it came to getting out of the EU, smuggle in, and I don't mean to be dishonest, I'm just saying, get those arguments, get people talking about them. We saw it with the Liberal Democrats. The Liberal Democrats have somewhat changed. They had taken an approach a number of years ago saying, well, look, we're going to leave Brexit. It's done. Let's move on from it. But they have somewhat softened on that. So they are a bit more open to supporting joining the European Union. So I would say put pressure on the politicians, but also if you know people who are in the media often, try and get onto them, contact them on social media or contact them in whatever way you can, and ask them to continue to promote or to start promoting a pro-European message. Because it can't be just about we need to rejoin. It also has to be about why it's important to rejoin.
Andy has put a question in the chat and he's got a lot of background noise, drum and bass apparently, in the next room. So I'm going to ask his question. What factors do you see making us attracted to the EU as a candidate to rejoin? And what factors would hold them back apart from our obvious political instability?
So I think the positives, of course, like before, the UK is a massive market for the EU. Businesses in the EU want to trade with Britain. I think it's important to understand that Brexit has damaged that somewhat. And in some areas, it may take a long time to recover. Even if the UK were to rejoin tomorrow, there are some businesses maybe who have been burnt by the whole process of exporting outside the single market, and they have maybe moved on or found other markets. But I think a massive positive for the EU is, of course, trade. And then, of course, it's the UK as a security partner. I think that's really, really important, especially in this period of time. So the UK also, when it comes to education, the high profile universities in the UK at the forefront of research and technology, research into technology or other fields. They have been crying out to be part of, for example, the Horizon project or Euroatom, things like that. So a cooperation between the two sides is always beneficial. So I think, once again, it's like the people, when I speak to Europeans, they would love for the UK to be back in. They hate the idea of needing a passport, for example, to go on holiday. They hate the idea of not being able to trade like it was before. I've spoken to people who are trying to sell goods into the UK and they need to fill out a lot of paperwork. And, they didn't have to do that before. So they would welcome that. So that, even though I think the politicians in Europe, even the Eurosceptic ones, would like to have a better relationship with the UK, and they understand the benefit of that. So a number of things: the economy, security, they would be the main ones, and then unity. Especially, if this is an argument I often use with the anti-immigration people. It's like, do you think it's better to have a good relationship with the European countries if you want to deal with immigration? And they're forced to say yes. So that's another area that could be promoted, also to people who are anti-immigration.
I meet my MP regularly. She's a member of Labour for Europe, She feeds me tasty bites that she shouldn't really do, actually, because no MP should ever talk to a member of the public and expect them not to repeat it. Uh, so on Saturday, in the midst of a conversation about the disaster of Brexit, because she's very much against it, although you're right, publicly, there's a slightly different discourse in Labour about it. And we were talking about the fact the Overton window is now moving. The Green Party have leapfrogged the Lib Dems. The Lib Dems are now battering Farage and Labour with Single Market and Customs Union, which paradoxically is a much more difficult ask, according to John Curtis, because it would be opposed by both sides. And so we had a huge agreement about all of that. And then she just slipped into the conversation that Starmer's going next year.
Oh, okay.
Meaning me, of course, to keep that completely confidential. So I've kept it completely confidential within these 9 people here, or 10 people. That may change the. I think that might be why James O'Brien is now talking about who should we select, as if he knows. So obviously, people further up the food chain do know this stuff. But anyway, she told me as a sort of slightly yeah, inappropriate move, knowing full well that I would repeat it. Just so I had the question I had in which I put in the chat. If the Overton window is moving slowly and the boats have moved out of the window and it's now okay to say the word Brexit because it wasn't. It was like Harry Potter, the forbidden word. What can we do to move it further?
I think what you did with when you were speaking to the MP is a good thing. So if people speak to your MP, I've mentioned before, I don't know if I mentioned on the channel, but I've mentioned on live streams how a protest is a wonderful thing, and I'm not against protesting, but a letter to an MP is much more powerful, or a conversation with an MP is much more powerful, because the MPs are worried about their constituents. So if their constituents are willing to vote for a different party, they will sit up and listen. So a protest, you could have 100,000 people march on a Saturday. It's not going to have much of an impact on MPs. But if you're able to speak to your MP, if you're able to sit down with them, or if you're able to send them a letter and get through to them, I recommend sending a letter or speaking to them directly about what you feel, about your worry about what's happening when it comes to the rise of Nigel Farage and the separation from Europe, and talk about how look at what happened during the pandemic. All the European countries were working together. The UK at the beginning was, of course, part of that as well. And we're able to resolve crises better when we're working together. The same with Ukraine. So the UK has been doing great work when it comes to supporting Ukraine along with the Europeans. So I would press about that, about convincing other members of the Labour Party to jump on. They have to be aware that this could, if the UK were to rejoin, it would boost GDP. It would, bring back freedom of movement. It would allow sectors of the economy to start hiring again like they were before. I think it's important to be honest with people and say, look, it's not going to happen immediately, but we need to get the wheels moving. So the politicians need to be on board with this as much as possible.
A few commentators around now are suggesting that Starmer is not sincerely committed to the so-called Brexit reset, but is simply trying to placate people in favour of joining the EU, and it's instead trying to align the Great Britain with America, with Trump's America.
I don't know, because with Keir Starmer, it's very difficult to read what he actually believes, because he has changed his position on a number of things quite often. I think he wants to have sort of cake and eat it at the same time. I think he wants to have a good relationship with both the EU and the US. So, and he thinks it's possible. And I think he thinks, once again, I'm just playing speculation here. It's very difficult to read him. But I think he believes that if he panders enough to Trump, he can keep him happy. And at the same time, he can have a good relationship with the European, because there are examples of attempts to rebuild the relationship post-Tory governments with the European Union. So there are examples of that. So we can see some sort of softening of the rhetoric and a rebuilding of the relationship. But when it comes to the US, I'm extremely critical. I think he should be standing up to Trump because Trump is a bully. Trump is not somebody who's reliable. We see it with what's happening in the Middle East at the moment. We see it what's happening with Ukraine. We saw what's happening with NATO. I think I understand the so-called special relationship that the UK wants to maintain, the special relationship with the US. I don't think that the US care about the UK. The Trump administration just frankly doesn't give a damn. But they want to be able to pressure the UK to do certain things, but they don't care about Starmer. So I think he's trying to have his cake and eat it. I think he wants to have a good relationship with both the US and the EU at the same time. Do I trust Starmer? No, I don't. I don't think he has U-turned on a lot of policies. I honestly don't know what he actually believes himself. I've seen a few interviews with him, but he comes across to me as somebody who has been prepared as a politician, a sort of printed out politician. This is what a politician should be. And while that sort of worked well in the early 2000s and the late 2000s, maybe, it doesn't really work today. And more people are looking for what they believe is to be authentic, like Nigel Farage or Zach Polanski. So I think we're heading in either of those directions, where they want people to speak a more sort of simple language to them and be less polished.
I want to go against what you've said, actually. I think the Prime Minister is actually doing pretty well. I think if you look at the government's rhetoric, they are slipping into their answers to questions about access to the market and things like that. And given the visceral anger in the north of England, where reform is biting at Labour's heels, and indeed they won a by-election, I think they're doing pretty well. I do agree with you a bit about the Conservative Party. I think the problem was the collapse of the conventional centre-right in this country, and Cameron was obviously a disaster, but not all his successors were. And in some ways, Sunak set the way ahead with his bilateral treaty between Macron and between France and the UK. It is incredibly positive. But the thing I was actually going to say to you is I do think in some ways, everybody's talking about mea culpa in the UK. The EU itself is a bit problematic. I mean, either Ukraine has changed everything or it hasn't. If Ukraine has changed everything, then you cannot, as the European Union, ignore the only country apart from France that's got a full suite of defence. And you include the UK in all the defence programmes on sensible terms. And other member states, I would suggest, should follow where France has led. And the relationship between the UK and Ireland, was a temporary one really 100 years ago. That needs to be adjusted. And the relationship, Germany's sort of following on from France. So I think it's not just the EU, it is a bilateral effort in the capitals. But the question I was really going to ask you, or it's a sort of statement, is we don't know what emergencies lie ahead of us. And the one mistake Truss made as Prime Minister was to forget that UK sterling is no longer a reserve currency. No British government can allow sterling to collapse. They have to do anything to stop it. And paradoxically, that could be our quickest way back into the European family, as a British government faced with a sterling collapse says whatever it takes, we will follow the EU. And effectively, that needs the EU to respond and say, you're a de facto, if not de jure member of the Eurozone.
I think the feeling within the European Union is that they want to have the UK back. They want to have a better relationship. But what you mentioned, I was just listening to what you mentioned there about the security issue. I think France and Germany would like to have a better relationship with the UK. And I'm not privy to the discussions, but I'm just speculating that it could be because the UK is no longer a member of the European Union that they're sort of holding them at arm's distance. I don't know if that's really the case. That's the only thing I could read into it. But it is an interesting thing that if the pound were to collapse, yeah, if it's no longer a reserve currency, that could be a motivator. Like in the early 70s, where the late 60s, early 70s, where the economy was doing really badly, and the UK decided we need to be part of the common or the European community at the time. So it could be something internally, something that we can't see at the moment that could be the driving force. And I've mentioned before, when it came to the pandemic, nobody could have predicted the pandemic, and it has completely changed society. So it could be something that we haven't seen yet. I am concerned about the United States at the moment under Donald Trump, and this could, in a sense, it could push the UK towards a better relationship with the European Union, because they realize that Trump isn't reliable, and while Trump may disappear, at the next election, it could be somebody who's even worse than Trump that could come along, or it could be somebody like J.D. Vance who takes over, who would just be Trump, continuity Trump.
You've been around quite a while, Max. You know probably quite a lot of the commentators on some of the social media platforms, not personally maybe, but of the type of thing that they put forward. I see arguments between people who claim to be a bit like yourself. I from Ireland, but I live in Switzerland, or I live in the EU, but I'm from, somewhere close to the UK, maybe not the UK. But they seem to delight in taking any argument, putting it down. How would you go about getting all of these strong opinions out there? Niall O'Connolly is one, Charles Napoleon is another one I've seen on Blue Sky Now as opposed to Twitter. And I see lots of arguments between certain people who are pro-EU, but they're seen or portrayed as being nitpicking. They're cherry picking the bits they want to do. They don't want to join the EU, but they'd like to have freedom of movement back, for example. So much effort there that's wasted. How could you get people to at least put leave the ardor at the door, come in, be strong-minded, but work together and push things forward? Is there anything you've thought about or given any, ounce of cycle to in your experiences over the years?
Thanks, Greg. I keep saying to use the Nigel Farage approach or the Brexiteer approach. The Brexiteers at the beginning were in disagreement. Okay, we should leave the single market but remain, or we should leave the EU but stay in the single market, or we should leave the EU all completely, or we should have a better relationship with some European countries. So they had about 100 different types of Brexit, and they were not making a lot of traction. But they realized that if they circled around one argument, just leave, then they were able to convince the public. And then that's what they did. I don't know if they met in smoke-filled rooms or whatever, but they agreed together. This is what we need to do. We just sell the idea of leaving. And I think it's not about being dishonest. It's about winning the argument in a sense. Like, people understand it would be better for the UK to rejoin. So I think the Remain or Rejoin groups should rally around one argument, and that has to be just to rejoin. The details can be worked out later on. In the same way as I speak to people who are supporters of Scottish independence, and there's a lot of, okay, what about the currency, and what about borders, and what about trade, and all. And I say, look, these are technical issues, and the technical issues are the easy ones, actually. They can be difficult, but at the end of the day, technical issues can be worked out. It's the political one that is most difficult. And the political one is convincing people to support that, to rally around one thing. If you look at what's happening on the left in politics, you have the Green Party to a certain extent, you have the Labour Party, and you have your party as well. And anyone who's been following your party can see how it's all fractured into a sort of People's Front of Judea type of situation. Because they're all arguing over detail. They're not arguing, okay, if you look at politicians on the right, they put aside detail and they say, we want power. And they've been successful at that. The Conservative Party, I still have a feeling that the Conservative Party could come back. Not at the moment, they're completely destroyed at the moment, but they could come back. But if you look at what the Conservative Party have been, why they're so successful is because they put aside their differences and focus on power. I'm not saying that's a good thing, But if you want to make change, if you want to implement those changes, you need to be in a position of power. So you need to rally around a single issue. And for the rejoin groups, it is a simple single issue: rejoin the European Union. The details will come after, but you need to focus. People can have their disagreements, but they have to rally around. They have to form a unit group, a united group, and that has to be, yes, rejoin the European Union.